What if the end of a war wasn't actually the start of peace, but the first chapter of the next war? Well, that's pretty much the story of World War I. Everyone called it the war to end all wars, but the peace treaty that came after, it did the exact opposite. It basically planted all the seeds for a century of conflict. Let's dig into how that happened.
And this, right here, really gets to the heart of the problem. On one side, you've got this incredible promise, a permanent peace after a war that was just catastrophic. But on the other side, you have the reality, a settlement that just created a whole new list of problems and resentments, fueling instability for decades.
So how on earth did this happen? Well, it all boils down to this fundamental clash at the heart of the post-war world. It was a battle between two massive and completely opposing ideas.
Okay, so on one hand, you had the winners, right? Powers like Britain and France. And they were still operating with that classic old-school imperial mindset. They looked at the defeated German and Ottoman empires and saw a bunch of prizes to be carved up and divided. But smashing right up against that idea was something new and powerful: self-determination. People, inspired by leaders like U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, were demanding the right to decide their own futures.
So what do you do when you have two ideas that just can't coexist? You come up with a compromise. Or at least that's what they called it. The solution was the mandate system. But as we're about to see, this whole thing was maybe built on a bit of a lie. So this compromise was called the Mandate System, and it was set up by the new League of Nations. Now, officially, the idea sounded pretty good. The victorious nations would guide, and I'm using air quotes here, they would guide the former colonies until they were ready to stand on their own 2 feet. A pathway to independence. Sounds great, right? The system was actually broken down into 3 tiers, all based on how ready the Allies decided these places were for self-government. So you had Class C mandates, which were pretty much just colonies with a new name. Then you had Class B, mostly in Africa, which were promised they'd be developed towards eventual self-rule. And then at the very top, Class A, in the Middle East, which were supposedly on the fast track to full independence. But this is where the whole thing falls apart. For those Class A mandates in the Middle East, that fast track to freedom never happened. Britain and France just drew borders to suit themselves and ran them like any other colony. And for Class B and C, it was the same story. The interests of the European power always came first. It was less of a guiding hand and more of a new cage. So you can imagine, for the people who had hoped for real freedom, this wasn't liberation at all. They had just traded one imperial master for another. This feeling of betrayal, this profound disillusionment, would have consequences that echoed for decades. But hey, this game of empire building wasn't just for Europeans. Over in Asia, a new power was making some serious moves. Japan, who was actually one of the victors of World War I, had its own big plans for expansion. See, unlike the defeated empires, Japan now had a seat at the big table, and they used that power. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria, hungry for its coal and iron to fuel their growing industry. They set up a puppet state, and when the League of Nations told them to stop, what did they do? They just walked out. It was a massive challenge to the entire post-war system. And of course, you can't have an empire without some good PR. How did Japan frame all this aggression? They gave it this really noble-sounding name. They claimed their mission was to free Asia from Western colonialism and create this amazing, self-sufficient bloc of Asian nations, led by Japan, naturally. But the reality? Yeah, it was a much different story. This was just a classic colonial project, plain and simple. It was all about dominating the region and sucking up its resources for Japan's benefit. A new empire? Just using the same old playbook.
Now, you can't expect people to just put up with all these broken promises and new bosses. Of course not. All over the world, that post-war disappointment started to spark some incredibly powerful new movements of resistance.
Let's take a look at India, for example. I mean, after sending huge numbers of soldiers and resources to help Britain in the war, Indians got basically nothing in return. That frustration spread like wildfire, creating the perfect environment for a much stronger independence movement to finally take root. And that movement found its energy in a new leader with a totally radical idea, Mohandas Gandhi. His whole philosophy of satyagraha, or nonviolent civil disobedience, was an absolute game changer. He showed millions of people how to peacefully defy unfair British laws. And probably the most famous example of this in action was the 1930 Salt March. See, the British had a monopoly on salt, forcing Indians to buy it from them at a high price with heavy taxes. So, to protest this, Gandhi led his followers on a 240-mile march to the sea to make their own salt. It was simple, symbolic, and an unbelievably powerful act of defiance.
And the impact was just massive. It was a direct challenge to British authority, sure, but it also got the world's attention. It inspired huge acts of civil disobedience all across the country. This march was a real turning point, and it proved just how powerful peaceful resistance could be.
And this kind of struggle wasn't just happening in India. Over in South Africa, the African National Congress was fighting for very similar goals, things like justice and self-determination. But their fights were so different. While the Indian National Congress was fighting an external colonial power, the ANC in South Africa was up against a deeply rooted system of internal racial segregation, apartheid. It meant their struggle would be much, much longer and much harder.
Okay, so let's tie all of this together. The end of World War I wasn't some clean break from the past. It was messy, it was complicated, and the flawed peace that came out of it really did shape the world we're all living in today.
So, what's the big picture here? Well, the broken promises of the mandate system created resentment that still exists today. The rise of an imperial Japan totally upended the global order. And those powerful anti-colonial movements, they laid the foundation for the end of empires. At the end of the day, the so-called peace after World War I left behind a legacy of unresolved issues that would directly feed into the next World War and beyond.
And that leaves us with a pretty heavy final thought. When you look at the world today, it's really worth asking yourself, how many of the conflicts we see on the news are just the long, faint echoes of promises that were broken and tensions that were left to simmer more than 100 years ago?